Thank you so much, Sarah, and everybody for having me and giving me the opportunity to present this here at the North American Heritage at Risk. I've been following the series more or less. I often watch these lectures late at night here in Saipan. So, and then when I saw there was an opportunity to present, I thought to myself, like, is there something that I can present on? And I thought about some research that I did a number of years ago while I was working for the national parks at Joshua Tree National Park. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening or this morning for most of you folks. Is some work I was doing while there. And I apologize already. I had a lot of slides and I had to go through and cull the slides back. So and there still may be too many, I don't know. So I'll keep track of the time. And if I need to, I may need to go rather quickly through some of them. But I'll try to be mindful of the time here. But the topic is, as you mentioned, it is a rather broad topic. And of course, these are issues that are relevant, I think, to virtually any type of archaeological site, and not necessarily just specifically rock art, but of course these are geared mostly towards rock art in this case, because rock art in particular, unlike many other archaeological sites, has archaeology in general has a really broad appeal, but rock art in particular, because I think people can associate with it. It's very visible. It's got a high profile. It also, in effect, makes it somewhat of a target, and one has to think about management of rock art sites in a very different way that one has to think about other types of sites, although they certainly are subject to some of the same conservation issues that any archaeological site is subject to. So typically when I do this talk, I talk a little bit about conservation management plans, but it's going to just kind of go briefly through conservation management and go into the actual work and data collection that we had actually undertaken for this particular study. But I put this up here as kind of I guess, something to think about as far as what conservation management is. And this is how conservation management was defined in the Burra Charter. This was defined for Australian rock art, but I think is relevant to rock art more generally. And I inserted the quotes there, or the parent parentheses, but it kind of captures what conservation management is, and it's all the processes of looking after a place so as to retain its cultural significance. That particular site that you see there is the Oasis of Mara. It's an area just outside. It's actually part of the Joshua Tree National Park, or at least part of it is, but it's also an area that is significant to the tribes. There are a number of different tribes that at least 4 or more that really claim significance to that particular area. And so when we think about conservation management and what it ultimately means, it ultimately means that we need to maintain these places in such a way that it doesn't diminish in any way, that it really reduces its cultural significance, not only to would-be visitors, but to anybody that has a stake in those particular places. And those are things that we should always keep in mind when we're thinking about and conceptualizing conservation management. There, of course, are going to be many different needs and different stakeholders and different people have different types of interest in these sites. Rock art in particular is one that I mentioned has a rather broad appeal cross-culturally, and so we have to be wary of the different people that may be interacting with these sites and what the conservation issues and conservation concerns may be at these different sites. So I put this slide up here, just kind of thinking about what conservation management is and why we need to think about conservation management at different sites. And anybody who's worked at a land management agency, such as the national parks or Forest Service, BLM, or really any type of involvement in thinking about sites, how to protect sites, what the conservation needs are for these sites. It often struggles with this particular question, and sometimes we also have to maybe justify this for the general public as well, and why it is important to think about, conservation management and think about conservation management plans specifically. And this is a quote that actually comes from Yanni Lobster. He's does quite a bit of rock art conservation himself, and I really liked. I paraphrased this quote, but I think it is very telling. And I'm just gonna read it here and we discuss it. But it's a site can ultimately be managed in a systematic, planned way, or it will be inherently managed by visitors that may be unaware of the conservation needs of the site. So if we aren't proactive about managing sites, in a national park, for instance, and this is of course going to be mostly related to Joshua Tree, but is could be applicable to any national park. If there isn't a plan to manage a site, then the visitors are essentially going to manage it for you, and it may not necessarily be in the best interest of conserving that particular site. So when we look at national parks, and this is certainly applicable to most national parks, but these are figures for Joshua Tree. Joshua Tree it's in Southern California. I have a map on where its location if you're not familiar with where it is, but it is conveniently located to several major metropolitan areas. It's within a couple hours drive of the Los Angeles metropolitan area. It's right next door to Palm Springs, and also within a couple hours drive of Las Vegas. And so it is a very popular park. Visitation has been increasing exponentially, as you can see by the graph there, as people discover that it's a great place to go. And there are some parks that really struggle to get a couple 100,000 visitors a year. Places like Joshua Tree struggle with the amount of visitation that it received, and continuing to increase and struggling to manage the sites, because a lot of the conservation management really is trying to protect, as I like to say, it's trying to protect the park from the visitors, because as many people say, I've heard this analogy, they love the park to death, and too much visitation can be problematic for cultural resource management and managing these different sites and the conservation needs of these sites. And the traditional motive, or I'm sorry, the traditional, I'm trying to think of the right word, but I guess the traditional way that parks have tried to manage sites is through confidentiality, just non-disclosure. Not disclosing the location of these sites. The idea being that people don't necessarily know where they are, and they'll just kind of protect themselves. I think that was largely true in the past, but when we're talking about like the 1970s, 1980s, stuff like that, but we live in a different age. We live in the technological age. We live in the digital age. Social media has really changed that, and I think these somewhat archaic mindsets of if people don't know where they are, if we don't disclose locations, that they'll just kind of be protected from themselves. And that may be true of some backcountry sites that are really inaccessible, but most certainly sites that are quite easily accessible. Thinking that people don't necessarily know where they are, that they're not going to visit them, is kind of, I think, misleading ourselves. And we're perhaps not necessarily cognizant and perhaps even ignoring the potential problem. Social media is essentially exposing these sites to greater visitation, which means we need to start thinking very differently about the conservation of these sites, the conservation needs, what the impacts are to these sites based due to increased awareness and exposure of these sites to the broader public. So what is the purpose of a management plan? And these are things to think about when trying to conceptualize what to put into a management plan, how to create one, and also what to think about it as far as the conservation needs of a particular site. So a management plan can be somewhat of a broad kind of plan, thinking about how to what the best approach is to help conserve a site, in accordance with the Organic Act, which most park service units are tried to follow. So these are some of the key guidelines in a management plan. first outlining the significance of the site. That's something as archaeologists we generally do anyway. Determine why conservation is necessary at the site. That's going to be based on data, information about what the conservation needs are of a particular site. And I'm going to actually get into that a little bit more in depth. Identify the conditions that are affecting the site. So sometimes we have these broad conservation management plans that are kind of blanket plans for every site within a particular park service unit or in a unit, land management unit. But that may not necessarily be applicable to all sites. Different sites have different conservation needs, and what's going to be affecting one site isn't necessarily going to be applicable to other sites as well. And so these should be based on good data and not just based on assumptions and these kind of blanket kind of cookie cutter approaches to protecting and conserving sites. And then propose the final aspect is proposing ways to conserve a site. And these are based on what the perceived conservation needs are of a particular site. So ordinarily in this slideshow, I actually have a bunch of slides talking about some of the transformational processes that affect different sites, what the factors of deterioration are that need to be considered in particular to rock art sites or that are peculiar to rock art sites. I had to unfortunately remove all those, but I'm going to get right into I'll allude to some of those later on in the talk, but I'm going to talk about a study that I conducted while I was working at Joshua Tree. And this is where it is located for those who have not actually had an opportunity to visit, but you can see where it is pretty accessible to the Southern California population. It's about, I think it's 800,000 square miles of park. So it's a pretty large park unit. There are quite a few rock art sites in Joshua Tree. I think there's, if I recall, there is over 200 rock art sites. This is just looking at a sample of some of those sites. And these are some of the more easily accessible ones. These are just kind of more general locations here. Although I think for the most part, most people know where these are too. So this study was looking at a couple of sites, several sites within Joshua Tree itself, and then a site outside of Joshua Tree that is managed in a very different way. And I call this talk a tale of two management plans, because ultimately what it was looking at management styles of the Park Service and sites within the Park Service. This is the Park Service boundary here. So these sites are all within Joshua Tree. And this is a site just outside. It's actually on the one of the entrances to the park. You actually drive basically right beside it. But this is actually on San Bernardino County land, on the water management land. They were the ones who traditionally would manage this land. And of course, they have a very different management style. They don't, and of course, have a very different goals as far as protection of sites. So this presented an opportunity to really look at what the different management styles and meant as far as conservation and preservation of these different sites. And so this is a comparison of the two different, I guess a comparison and contrast between the two different sites and the management styles and plans for these different sites. Of course, in a National Parks Service unit, the management is under the Organic Act, which is essentially the mandate of the Park Service units more broadly. And the primary way of preserving these sites is through restricted access, and mostly through confidentiality, not necessarily disclosing where these sites are located. The Coyote Hole is the name of that site that's outside. It's in the village of Joshua Tree. It's a small hamlet just outside of the park. Was managed by the San Bernardino County Flood Control District. Essentially has unrestricted access as opposed to with the Park Service sites. There are signs to help deter, would-be destructive visitor behavior at the site with greater or lesser success, I suppose. But there were signs. There are people who are out there using OHVs, without any restricted access. Of course, within Joshua Tree, using OHVs is essentially prohibited throughout the park. And also at Coyote Hole, the Mojave Desert Land Trust had done a graffiti remediation of some of the canyon. And I'll talk a little bit about the canyon here shortly. But there was quite a bit of when I first arrived in the area in 29 Palms, being a rock art guy, I was interested in looking to see where some rock art sites are, and that was one that came up like right away. And so I went out to take a look, and it was a box canyon, and many of the walls were just basically cluttered with spray paint with multiple coats. So it was certainly a problem at that particular site. As far as I could tell, it wasn't necessarily affecting any of the rock art, but it certainly was unsightly, and it can certainly lead to other conservation issues if it's left untendered. So and there was a proposal. They're gonna transfer the San Bernardino County had proposed transferring the land over to the and I can't remember the name of the organization. It was it's like a Native American land trust, something like that, that was going to actually assume management of the site. And so the Mojave Desert Land Trust was essentially I guess they were kind of the middleman, kind of handling this transaction between the two entities, between the county and this nonprofit organization that was going to assume management of this particular site. And it was through the Mojave Desert Land Trust as well that a number of volunteers had come out to undertake this graffiti remediation. And these are some photos that I took of some of the volunteers that were doing the graffiti remediation. I didn't have any involvement at all. I just knew that they were going to be out there, and I asked if I could just be an observer to see exactly what they were going to do. I have a strong interest in rock art conservation management, so I really kind of wanted to see what they're going to do. I also was a little concerned that they may be a little more aggressive at their graffiti removal than we probably should have warranted that particular site. And I think that was not unfounded, as I saw the remediation taking place. They were using elephant snot, which some of you may be familiar with. It works great, as far as removing paint for sure, and spray paint from rock surfaces. But I don't really know if we know what the long-term repercussions are of using elephant snot. And on top of that, and that's actually what they were doing. So they would apply elephant snot using a paintbrush, and basically they just slather it on there. And you have to let it sit on the surface for 24 hours before it really takes effect. And then they use these power washers to basically wash off the elephant snot. Sometimes it was somewhat, I guess, somewhat stubborn, and so they would actually use tools such as wire brushes and things like that, or basically these metal blades to basically scrape off the rest. And I was a little concerned when I saw this woman here actually scraping at this rock surface. This is monzonite quartz, and so it's pretty friable. And I basically just saw this rock kind of crumbling away as she was scraping away at it. I don't know that any rock art was being affected, but at the same time, it was somewhat of a more aggressive approach to graffiti remediation than possibly warranted at that particular site. But what this did is that it presented an opportunity to really look at, again, the management between these different sites, and to look at a site that was treated. So I honestly don't really know if there's been long-term longitudinal studies looking at the long-term effects of applying elephant snot to rock art surfaces. And so this was an opportunity to necessarily, it wasn't necessarily as long-term as I'd like. I think it would be great if somebody could continue this work, but really looking at what the long-term effects of this type of treatment to rock art sites is, because I think that's largely what's missing from our understanding of the treatment of sites. So while this was all happening, it was kind of interesting because everything was kind of happening all at once. There was a site that several of my coworkers and I went out to. It's called Split Rock, and this is essentially what that particular site looked like. You can see me there in the right-hand photo. You can see the amount of vandalism graffiti on the shelter wall. This is a rock shelter, easily accessible to visitors visiting Joshua Tree. And I do want to point out, I am looking at the vandalism under Hamlets. I am not adding to it. So just to make that clear, I know it kind of looks like I might be scratching my name in there, but and so I actually went out there to take a look at some of the vandalism. Mostly it was chalk, but there was also charcoal that was used to scratch initials and things of that sort in the surface. There's quite a bit of soot on the rock shelter ceiling because people would build campfires there. They're not supposed to be camping there as a day use only, but that doesn't necessarily stop people. And a number of other conservation concerns. So we went out to take a look at this particular site because it was one that's certainly of concern, and it does have pictographs within that rock shelter. Well, it turns out the same week that we went out to take a look at it, that one of the park rangers, who this was basically an eyesore, took it upon himself to have maintenance go out there and basically pressure wash the surface, the ceiling of this rock shelter. You can see the after effects there on the left-hand side, and you can see it did certainly remove the most of the chalk vandalism and graffiti. But I was rather aghast when I heard that, and I was thinking about, well, what are going to be the long-term effects of that? I think it was a rather reckless act. It wasn't done in consultation with the cultural resources team, and it was an unfortunate circumstance. But what it did do is it did present an opportunity to look at, again, what are the effects of any sort of treatment to these sites. By the way, I've heard this many times, as far as people wanting to clean up rock art sites using water. Water, unfortunately, is one of the worst things you can add to a rock art panel, because water is the catalyst for everything else, that all the deterioration factors that will affect a rock art panel. And so that was really the main concern after they pressure washed it. So what we did is we chose, I was working with one of my coworkers, Mary Oster, and you can see her there in the photo. You see a couple more photos of her because I was snapping a lot of these photos. And she also was helping me with a lot of the work. So I got some action shots of her helping me collect some of our data. And so we chose these different sites, and we wanted to have our controls where we were looking at different factors of management at these different sites. So you saw where those different sites were in the park, and then at Coyote Hole we chose it's a fairly extensive site, so we chose essentially three different sites within Coyote Hole to have a comparison with these sites in Joshua Tree, and so we chose sites that had different conservation concerns. So one are sites that are infrequently visited. These are sites that aren't necessarily well known to the public, and generally, as far as we know, don't receive a significant amount of visitation. And this is just a D-stretch image of particularly the one on the left, because you can't necessarily see the rock art on that particular panel, but you can see it under the D-stretch. We chose two sites that we know are frequently visited, both at Coyote Hole on the left-hand side there. It's a frieze, has a pictograph on the canyon wall there, and then a site within Joshua Tree known as the Red Lady site. And we know that actually is relatively frequently visited, especially thanks to social media. D-stretch image again on the left-hand side of the rock art in Coyote Hole, because it is a little harder to visualize. And then a treated site, and I just talked about the treated site there at Split Rock and how that was treated. And since they were doing the graffiti remediation at Coyote Hole, it did present an opportunity. Now, for the most part, they were applying the Elephant Knot to rock art faces or rock faces that didn't contain, as far as we know, any rock art. But I was out there when and I won't necessarily mention the person's name, but Mary and I were collecting some data out there, and he was just testing the elephant snot and accidentally applied it to a panel that actually does have rock art unintentionally. And that is actually this panel here. And so what it did is it presented an opportunity to look at an actual panel that had been treated with elephant snot as well. And just to help visualize the rock art on both of these, so the right-hand side is the pictographs there at Split Rock, which are they're more visible after they cleaned it, but it's most certainly more visible under D-stretch. And then on the left, at there at Cuddy Hole is a petroglyph site, and you can see the petroglyph there in that photo, the close-up photo. So I want to talk a little bit about the methods that we used, and some of this was a lot of this just comes from going through the literature and looking at what kinds of conservation needs do rock art sites face. And as archaeologists, we're all familiar with transformational processes and how they apply to archaeological sites. The same is true for rock art sites as well. It's just that the transformational processes are a little bit different than they are for subsurface sites. And so what I did is I created a 14-page data sheet. You can see the front page of it here on the screen, on the slide here. And what it did, what it is it's a data sheet that goes through these different elements and concerns for rock art sites. You know, looking at the potential different possible concerns that a rock art site may face, anything from anthropogenic changes to natural, and looking at all of the N transforms and the C transforms that may be potentially affecting a site. And then what I really wanted with this particular data sheet, and I'll show what the results of that are a little bit later on, is a way of using it to somewhat empirically produce a way of actually looking at the actual threat. And so the threat of these different things, it could be something like the accretion of calcium oxalate, for instance, is, you know, what is the severity of the effect on that particular site, you know, and is it you know, relatively minor, or is it a relatively severe threat? And then given these numerical values 1 through 4, and then using those, those numbers can be essentially tallied up, and then using those to look at the actual overall concerns of severity to that and threat to that particular site. So this produces that rating system that essentially rates the level of threat to these particular sites. And that can be important when you're thinking about conservation management of a site and which sites are at greatest risk. So this is really the funnest part of this research, is like, once you know what the concerns are, it's like thinking about what is the best way to collect data in particularly empirical data. You know, I'm a data hound. I love collecting data. I love working with it. And so the more data you can collect, I mean, it's just and plot it and look at it graphically. It's just it really helps to really better understand in a more objective way what some of these concerns are. I don't know how many times I've heard more kind of subjective, you know, assessments of a particular site, like, oh, well, the pictographs there seem like they faded since the last time I was there, you know, 3 years ago. You know, if somebody can remember, I can barely remember what I had for breakfast, let alone what pictographs looked like 3 years ago. Not a real reliable indicator, but what I wanted to do was to actually collect data that we could actually look for over a length of time, and we can actually look for patterns that may, so we can actually start to identify some of the conservation concerns of these sites. So I discovered these Ryobi tools at Lowe's, or actually at Home Depot, I think, and they're great because they work with your iPad, and that's actually my iPad there. That's a petimeter. It's a moisture meter that I picked up at Home Depot. And the great thing about it is it records the data, so you can actually save it. And on the right-hand side, you can actually see what the actual readout looks like. So it'll give you, it'll tell you what the percentage of moisture is in the rock support. and then you can actually save it. And you can actually take a picture, of course, with the iPad where you're taking that reading, so you can actually be consistent in where you take the readings each time that you visit the site. Surface temperature is something else that's another concern. You can see, again, it's one of those Ryobi tools. So this is just using an infrared thermometer. It connects to the iPad. You can save that data. And, it has that laser, so you can actually exactly point to where you're actually taking that reading from. So unfortunately, Ryobi doesn't have tools for everything, but sometimes it's just going back. Although, of course, now Munsell has that digital colorimeter that I'd like to get my hands on, but I didn't have one at the time, so I was just using the standard Munsell chart to look at the actual pictographs in this case, as well as the support, and to look at changes in the color in a somewhat more objective way than would be apparent just with the naked eye. Light intensity, this is a light meter, and measuring the light intensity in lumens at each site. Unfortunately, this one doesn't necessarily record the data. So we actually had a data sheet that I prepared to actually manually record the data in a spreadsheet or it would be entered into a spreadsheet. Climatic data, and this is using a kind of it's a handheld weather meter that records wind speed, wind direction, relative humidity, atmospheric temperature, among other things. Those were the main things that I was concerned with as far as rock art conservation management. So you can see I'm there with my my portable weather meter. As far as wind directions, you actually have to point it in the direction of the wind in order to what it'll do is to give you a compass bearing on the wind direction. But you have to point it in the direction of the wind. So I just use the low-tech way, a method of using a piece of flagging tape to help me point in the right direction as far as where the wind was blowing. So we're gonna go into the results of that we and all this was recording those data sheets along with that 14-page data sheet that I alluded to earlier. And this actually are the scores that came from a different ranking of those different sites. And so just kind of had these different ranges of, and to be honest, I can't remember what the actual ranges were off the top of my head, but I had like a 0 through maybe 10 is rather mild threat. 10 through 20 is a moderate threat. 20 and above is a severe threat. And so you can see what the results are. And this essentially means that there are multiple transformational processes that are affecting a particular site. And that's really oftentimes the case. When people think about conservation management of rock art sites, they often almost solely focus on the anthropogenic changes. And that is, of course, very important, but oftentimes ignoring the natural changes that are occurring as well. And so, and they oftentimes work together, and they don't work independently of one another. As we know, we have to think of them in a whole and in a holistic way when we're thinking about what the conservation needs are of our particular site. And so you can see that several of these sites are at severe risk. And so the sites within Coyote Hole, which is just called study site 1, 2, and 3. This is a Red Lady site here. This is what's called that Red Diamond site. And I should have named it earlier, but we'll see some more slides on that one. And this here is the Split Rock site. This is the one that was treated with the water pressure, or that was treated by cleaning it up with the water sprayers. And so, and something else to keep in mind too is that, what we were doing is we're going out relatively regularly to record this data. So it's going out once a week to record this data, so that we had data to actually look at and that we could compare over a long period of time. But you can't just always go out when the weather's nice, when the sun's out, because you're going to collect the same data over and over. And when I like to emphasize, especially with people who are monitors or even site stewards, if they're engaged in site steward programs, is sometimes you have to go out when the weather is not ideal, because that is when you get some really interesting data. And so, of course, there were days when it was hot, hot and sunny. Some days when it was colder. Some days when it was rainy. And when I saw it was raining, it would rain very infrequently in the desert. But when it did, I would hop in my Jeep and I would head to these sites because I wanted to see what was going on. And these are some photos I took out at Coyote Hole with when it was raining. I actually realized that maybe going out when it's like pouring rain in the desert isn't the best idea because flash flooding is a particular concern, and I actually almost perished trying to collect my data. But we do what we have to get good data, I suppose. But you can see here, this is Coyote Hole. You can see where it basically turns into ephemeral stream when there's a downpour of rain. You can see where the water is pooling. This is actually the water actually on this rock face, on rock surface. You can basically see the calcium carbonate actually starting to accumulate on the rock face there. And that's actually where the pictograph is there. So this is the Red Lady site. And I think I've got a couple more. Okay, a couple more photos coming up here. So when I was told when starting that one of the primary concerns was visitation to this particular site, and not disputing that is definitely a concern because it is a site that does get visited quite frequently. And there was this trough or this furrow that you can see actually through the shelter. You can walk all the way through the shelter. It's basically just these two boulders, and there's the rock art is actually if you enter there's a bedrock mortar here. And then if you walk into the shelter, the pictograph is off to the left of that you saw earlier of that female anthropomorphic figure. So, and this furrow was thought to be a product of people basically just walking through the site. And so the Park Service, in their infinite wisdom, decided to place this sign here to try to restrict that kind of behavior, because people respond well when they see prohibitive signage. And I say that sarcastically because I think we can all relate to know that prohibitive signage is not effective. It's kind of the old saying, if you tell somebody not to do something, that's exactly what they're going to do. And this is exactly what happens. I don't think prohibitive signage is very effective, and certainly that sign wasn't. Sign was actually placed on the other opposite end of the entrance here, and I don't know that it really had any effect at all. I also, again, you have to go to the site when the action is happening, and I certainly was out this site when people were visiting it. It was very, very frequently visited, but you can't always go when the weather is ideal either. And so the same day that it was raining there at Coyote Hole, it was also a prime opportunity to get out to the Red Lady site as well. And this is what I noticed, at the Red Lady site. I apologize for the delay. Is that furrow that you could see that was attributed to just foot traffic, and certainly that may have been contributing to it, but it was probably more related to the water drainage patterns, because as it rains, that's where the water drains, is right through the two boulders, right through the rock shoulder. So again, assuming that we know what the conservation needs are can be somewhat problematic when we're trying to think about a conservation management plan. We should actually know what the actual conservation concerns are. And I think this clearly showed that it wasn't foot traffic specifically, it was other concerns as well. At Coyote Hole, I went out to the site one day and noticed this. You might not be able to see it real well in the slide, but I was a little concerned when I saw looked like something had been excavating underneath, looked like a dog or something. I thought it was a dog, actually. It had been excavating under the boulder. This is the boulder containing the pictograph there. And because I thought it was a dog because I saw footprints. And when I was talking to Dan McCarthy, he's an archaeologist, been working in the area for a long time. Really actually introduced me to this particular site. He actually told me he thought he was actually coyotes. I was like, dude, no, there were footprints out there. So I really think somebody took their dog up there. He's like, those are probably my footprints. I was like, oh, that might be right. What size shoe do you wear? So, but just kind of gathering intel like that could be somewhat beneficial when you're trying to understand what the conservation needs are of a site. So I couldn't necessarily dispute it wasn't coyotes. It very well may be. It was definitely some canid of some sort. And but first thing I go to when I'm documenting a rock art site is I look for the footprints. Before I smear everything with my own, I look around for footprints and any sort of evidence of that people had already been there or animals or whatever. And so that's what we did at this particular site, and it was good data that we collected. This is again split rock. So you saw that site earlier when they had pressure washed it. The solution again was the standard Park Service solution is well, let's put a prohibitive well, in this case they wanted to I had been railing against this prohibitive signage. So they're like, okay, well this time let's do a hybrid type sign. We'll take into account what we generally do as a Park Service unit, but we'll also try to incorporate some of the things that Jeremy's talking about, because there might be some merit to it. This was the sign that they came up with, and I think their attempts at a hybrid sign was probably one of the worst ideas I had ever seen. This ended up being one of the worst signs I've ever seen. I think they should have actually stuck with the prohibitive signage. But it basically says, this is why this site is cool. What I was trying to say is we need more interpretive signage, because what that does is it changes the behavior of people as they come to a site. And if you have interpretive signage, they recognize the significance of that site, rather than trying to tell people this is a significant site, so stay out. That isn't necessarily the right combination that I was necessarily looking for, but that was what happened with this particular sign. What the actual effects were, I can't necessarily say for the long term. So when we overall then looking at the conservation concerns for these different sites, this is that the study site 1 within Coyote Hole, and I apologize, I kind of used the that design feature in PowerPoint because it makes some really good slides, but it did shrink the text a little bit, so I do apologize if it's a little hard to read. But some of the concerns that we identified, and these are based again on those transformational processes that are characteristic of rock art sites. But the concerns that we identified that were the major concerns at this particular site were horizontal and vertical water flows, calcium carbonate accretion on the rock surface, which you actually could see with the rainwater actually washing over the surface. Fissure soils, those are sediments that accumulate within the fissures and create problems over the long term. Erosion and deposition of sediment, that was mostly from the flash flooding that would characterize that particular canyon, and visitor contact, because it's definitely, it's on a freeze, so it's definitely exposed to people getting close to it and touching it, because that's a frequent concern for rock art generally. Study site 2, the concerns were vandalism, because it had been vandalized in the past, and then treatment with elephant snot, because this was that panel that that gentleman from MBLT had accidentally treated, not realizing that it was a rock art panel at the time. Vertical water flows, because it is exposed to the elements as well. Erosion of some of the subsurface deposits, because we're just not just concerned with rock art, but we're concerned, of course, also with the subsurface archaeology as well. And then, of course, rock varnish, which you can actually see on the rock face as well. And then study site 3, that was where the coyote was digging under the boulder. The concerns there include vandalism. What you see there is not actually petroglyphs, it's actually vandalism that someone's trying to emulate some of the rock art in the region. And we know this based on how it is superpositioning with some of the actual rock art on the panel. Dogs and coyotes digging, dogs or coyotes, I guess, canid digging under into the subsurface archaeological deposits. Iron films that were were precipitating on that rock surface, so eventually it's going to obscure the rock art. Vertical water flows, which were actually leading to mineral accretion, particularly of iron deposits on the rock face. The Red Lady site, the conservation concerns were deflation and erosion of the shoulder floor deposits. I'll get to that here shortly. Chalk from climbers and boulderers. It's a common pastime and recreation for people visiting Joshua Tree. Accretion of calcium carbonate, which you can actually see on the right side of the figure here. The accretion of calcium carbonate, actually obscuring some of the rock art there. Calcium oxalate, which is, you can also see actually obscuring some of the other imagery here in the shelter as well. And then alien abrasion, and that you can actually see actually that affecting some of the rock art, and some of that just comes from the actual data, because this actual shelter, because of where the wind direction and its orientation actually acts almost like a funnel or a wind tunnel, and actually almost concentrates the wind flow through that particular rock shelter. And then the red diamond site, main primary concerns here were soil erosion, case hardening, and vertical water flows. And then the split rock site, high visitation, vandalism, campfires I mentioned earlier, hygroscopic expansion of particulates. That's particular to the chalk, which is susceptible to hygroscopic expansion, and it can penetrate the porous rock surfaces. That was one of my main concerns when they treated it with water, that it's basically going to infiltrate and penetrate the rock surfaces, and some of these particulates may be somewhat problematic over the long run. And then disturbance to the subsurface archaeological deposits, with the campfires and things of that sort. And we already saw that sign. So just looking at some of the data from the site comparisons, there's just a few more slides here, so we'll be finishing up here pretty soon. But wanted to quickly show the results of some of that data. So this was the results of the moisture content. You can see that some of the sites are definitely do retain moisture for longer periods. And I would try to get out to these sites shortly after rainfalls to see how long the rock support would actually retain moisture. And there were some sites that were of greater concern, such as the red diamond site, would actually retain, and just because of the geology, would retain moisture for longer periods than other sites. It turns out split rock, with the site that they pressure washed, actually sheds water pretty quickly. And so that was actually somewhat of a relief, realizing that I went out there right after a rain event, actually even while it was raining, and it doesn't seem to retain moisture for as long of a period as other sites like the red diamond site did. The surface temperature of the site, some sites are in rock shelters, so they're in shade for at least part of the day, and some are exposed to the sun for almost the entire day. And this was the case with that study site 2, that one that had been was the treated site in Coyote Hole. It's a west facing panel, and during the latter part of the day, it receives very high temperatures. You can see sometimes it can be in excess of 100 degrees on the surface, just based on the angle of the sun and its intensity of the sunlight on that rock panel, a rock support. That correlates with the light intensity of, and grab my pointer here. Study site 2, you can see because it is exposed with that western exposure, it has some of the highest readings of some light intensity. Study site 3, that's also in Coyote Hole. It's an east-facing panel, and during, depends on when I was there. It's a box canyon, so if it's in the morning, this is getting a lot of daylight. If it's in the afternoon, this is getting a lot of daylight. Some of the other sites are in rock shelters, so they receive relatively minor amounts of direct sunlight. And relative humidity, and this I think is partially related to how quickly the rock support will actually shed water through the evaporation process. And it turns out that some sites where it retains moisture for longer periods also seem to exhibit higher levels of relative humidity. I think that's as the water is just essentially evaporating outside of the porous surface of the rock support. And you can see, for instance, the red diamond site that I mentioned does retain water for longer periods. The red lady site has some relatively high relative humidity readings, but split rock somewhat lower, and I think because it seems to shed water more quickly. Wind speed, and of course this just depends on the day in the desert. and you know, some days are windy, sometimes some days are not. I went out when it was particularly windy because I wanted to go out there when the weather conditions were happening, when these actual concerns were taking place. I went out on a particular windy day, and that's where you can see these higher spikes of wind speed. Well, this is the Red Lady site. You can see it. It's I think it was clocked at like 27 miles per hour. As I mentioned, it was just basically acting like a wind tunnel and just funneling that wind through that shelter. And I talked about deflation being a particular issue there. As I was collecting this wind data, I was being pelted with these particulates of sand that were just beaming me in the face. Rather painful at times. I mean, that's how intense the wind speeds were through that particular rock shelter, and obviously leading to concerns about alien abrasion and what those airborne particulates are doing to the rock art. It's essentially sandblasting in the rock art panels with speeds such as that. And then looking at wind direction, there wasn't really a clear correlation. You can see it's just kind of all over the place, but I'd expect that maybe collecting it over long periods of time and longer than this particular study, that you might start to see patterns. And yeah, that would be of concern when you're looking at the aspect of a particular rock art panel, you know, and what the wind direction may be and what that may mean as far as the preservation and conservation of that particular panel. So that's the last. I just want to throw out some acknowledgments here for the different agencies that were involved in the research. Of course, the Joshua Tree National Park, Great Basin Institute is actually the agency through which I was actually working when I was doing this work. Mojave Desert Land Trust, San Bernardino County Flood Control District, which did allow Mary and I the permit to actually conduct the study. The Native American Land Conservancy, which is the agency that was actually going to be assuming management of that particular site. And I'd like to see the site now. If anybody's actually out in that area, if they can take some pictures and send them to me, I'd love to see how that site is doing now. Obviously, I'm across the globe, so I can't really see what the condition of that site is today. The High Desert Nature Museum, which allowed us to present some of our research to their groups and also to an exhibit that they had. And Dan McCarthy for his assistance in our work as well.